Story 1. The Watcher in the Window. When I moved into my first apartment, it was everything I'd hoped for. Close to work, and with a beautiful view of the city skyline. The building was old but sturdy, the kind of place that creaked like it had secrets. My neighbors were polite but distant, and the landlord seemed relieved to finally rent the place. I didn't think much of it. The first strange thing I noticed was the window. My bedroom had a large window that overlooked the street below. It was charming during the day, but at night it felt like a black void staring back at me. On my third night in the apartment, I woke up suddenly, feeling watched. When I turned to the window, I froze. A figure was standing outside, staring in at me. It was impossible. My apartment was on the 4th floor, no balcony, no ledge, but there it was, a dark silhouette pressed against the glass. Its hands were splayed flat, and its face was just a pale blur, like someone had smudged away its features. I shot out of bed and turned on the light. The figure was gone. I convinced myself it had been a dream. The mind plays tricks when you're half awake, I told myself. The next night, it happened again. I woke up to a faint tapping sound. My heart stopped when I saw the figure back at the window. This time, I noticed something. Its head moved, tilting slightly, as if curious. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I backed against the far wall, heart pounding, and the tapping stopped. Then the figure raised its hand and waved at me. I ran out of the room and spent the rest of the night on my couch. The following day, I talked to the landlord. He looked uncomfortable when I mentioned the figure. "The windows don't open," he said, avoiding eye contact. "It's impossible for anyone to get up there." "But I saw someone," I insisted. He sighed and muttered something about previous tenants seeing things, before quickly changing the subject. I pressed him, but he wouldn't say more. That night, I stayed awake with all the lights on. I tried not to look at the window, but some force compelled me to glance up every now and then. Hours passed. At around 3 a.m., the tapping started again. This time, the sound was coming from the inside of the window. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I turned my head. The figure was there, but something had changed. It wasn't outside, it was in the room. It stood by the window, its blurred face staring straight at me. Its hand was still pressed against the glass, but it was turned around, now tapping from the inside. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It began walking toward me, its footsteps making no sound against the creaky wooden floor. As it came closer, I noticed a strange smell, something cold and metallic, like blood. When it was just a foot away, I shut my eyes and screamed. When I opened them, the figure was gone. The room was empty. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment in my pajamas, not stopping until I was several blocks away. The next morning, I went back with 2 friends to collect my things. My bedroom window was locked, but on the inside of the glass, we found handprints, large handprints. I never went back. I broke my lease, and the landlord didn't fight me on it. To this day, I don't know what I saw, but sometimes, when I'm walking late at night, I feel the same cold sensation of being watched. I've stopped looking up at windows, because once I did, and I saw it again. Story 2. The Man in the Vents. It started when my roommate, Ben, and I moved into a cheap 2-bedroom apartment in an older building downtown. The rent was a steal. and we figured it was because the place was outdated peeling wallpaper, flickering lights, and creaky floors. It didn't bother us much. The vents in the apartment were unusual though. They ran through every room with wide grates, old and rusted. You could hear everything through them, the hum of the building's pipes, distant murmurs of neighbors, and sometimes other noises. The first time I noticed something was off, I was alone in my room, gaming late into the night. Between matches, I heard a faint sound coming through the vent near my desk. It was rhythmic, almost like breathing. I leaned closer, assuming it was just the air system. But then it stopped. A moment later, I heard something else, a whisper. I froze, heart pounding, as I listened. The words were soft and unintelligible, like someone was speaking just out of earshot. I checked the hallway and Ben's room, but he was fast asleep. I shrugged it off and told myself it was the pipes or my imagination. The next day, Ben mentioned something strange over breakfast. "Hey, have you ever heard, like, voices in the vents?" he asked. My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "Last night, I swear I heard someone whispering. I couldn't make out what they said, but it sounded like they were talking about me." He laughed it off awkwardly, but I could see the unease in his eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, breathing, shuffling, the occasional tapping sound. At around 2 a.m., I heard it again, a voice. This time, the words were clearer. "I see you." I bolted upright in bed, staring at the vent across the room. My lamp cast just enough light to see the grate. That's when I noticed that something was behind the vent. Two pale eyes stared back at me through the slats. I screamed and stumbled out of the room, banging on Ben's door. He burst out, confused, and I dragged him to my room, pointing at the vent. But the eyes were gone. Ben didn't see anything and tried to calm me down, but I knew what I saw. For the next few days, the whispers got worse. We both started hearing them, sometimes soft laughter, sometimes our names. At night, we would hear faint scratching, like nails dragging along metal. We stopped talking about it because neither of us wanted to admit how terrified we were. One night, Ben decided to investigate. "I'll take the vent cover off. Maybe there's something stuck in there." "Like an animal," he said, trying to sound brave. I watched as he unscrewed the grate in his room. The vent was dark and empty, stretching deep into the building. He shined a flashlight inside, and we both leaned closer. That's when we saw it. A hand thin, pale, and impossibly long reached out from the darkness, grabbing Ben's flashlight and yanking it into the vent. We fell back, screaming, as the light disappeared into the black void, clattering as it was dragged away. We barricaded ourselves in the living room, too terrified to sleep. The noises continued, all night scratches, whispers, and at one point, a low, guttural laugh echoing through the vents. By morning, we'd had enough. We packed our things and left the apartment. The landlord seemed unsurprised when we broke the lease. "Didn't last long, huh?" he muttered, shaking his head. I asked him what he meant, and he sighed. "You aren't the first. Tenants always hear things, see things. Maintenance guys refuse to check the vents anymore. We moved out that day and never looked back. But sometimes, when it's quiet at night, I swear I can still hear it. The faint sound of tapping and a whisper, just out of earshot. I see you." Story 3. The Wrong Train. It was late, far later than I had planned to be out. I had stayed at a friend's house for dinner, and lost track of time. The subway station was nearly empty when I arrived. Just a few stragglers waiting for their last ride home. The air was cold, and the flickering fluorescent lights gave everything a sickly greenish tint. As I stood on the platform, I checked the time, 12:48 a.m. The final train of the night was due soon. I heard the low rumble of something approaching and felt relief. The train slid into the station, its screeching brakes echoing down the empty tunnels. But something was different. The train was old, much older than the ones I usually took. The cars were grimy, the metal tarnished, and the windows were black as though covered in soot. I hesitated, glancing at the empty platform behind me. There was no one else. The doors opened with a hiss, and I stepped inside. The moment I did, I knew something was wrong. The interior was dim, lit by weak yellow bulbs that buzzed faintly. The seats were torn, the stuffing spilling out like entrails. The air smelled musty, stale, like something had been rotting in there for years. I turned to step back out, but the doors slammed shut behind me. I was alone in the car. The train jolted forward, and I stumbled before grabbing onto a pole. Outside the window, there was nothing but blackness. No tunnels, no lights, just an endless void rushing past. I tried to steady my breathing. It's just an old train, a weird one, sure, but it'll get me home. Then I noticed the first sign of something truly wrong. There were no ads on the walls, only peeling posters with strange symbols I didn't recognize. In the far corner of the car sat a man. I hadn't noticed him when I boarded. He wore a tattered suit, his head slumped down so I couldn't see his face. His hands were pale and bony, resting unnaturally still on his knees. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound calm. "Do you know where this train is going?" The man didn't respond. He didn't move at all. I swallowed hard and sat down near the door, keeping my eyes on him. The train rocked and swayed as it sped through the darkness. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, no time, no battery icon, nothing, just a black screen. Minutes passed, tore, maybe hours. I couldn't tell anymore. Then the man shifted. Slowly, his head began to rise. My skin crawled as I watched him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. His face came into view, and I wished I hadn't looked. His skin was gray and sunken, stretched too tight over his skull. His mouth was wide, unnaturally wide, as though it had been cut open at the corners. His eyes were hollow black pits, staring at me. He grinned, his teeth yellow and crooked. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low rasp that scraped against my ears. I shot up and ran for the next car. The door was heavy, but I forced it open. I stumbled into the adjoining car and slammed the door shut behind me. This car was worse. The lights flickered erratically, casting long, shifting shadows. Seats were overturned, and the air was colder, so cold I could see my breath. I turned and froze. There were people in this car, or what used to be people. They were slumped in the seats, motionless, their skin gray and lifeless, their heads all turned toward me in unison, their hollow eyes staring. I backed away, heart pounding. I needed to get off this train. I ran to the far end of the car, flinging open the next door. The same thing. More figures, more empty, soulless eyes. Some of them began to twitch, as though trying to stand. I kept running, car after car, but the train never ended. It was as though it stretched on forever, each car filled with more of those things. My chest tightened with panic. I could hear whispers now, faint and indecipherable, growing louder as I ran. Finally, I reached a car where the door at the far end was different. It wasn't a door at all, it was a window, but through it, I saw something, a light, an opening. I ran for it, but as I did, I heard the sound of shuffling footsteps behind me. I didn't dare look back. I threw myself through the window and landed hard on cold concrete. I looked up and realized I was back on a subway platform. The train was gone, and the air was silent. I scrambled to my feet and ran up the stairs into the night. I don't know what that train was or where it was going. I've tried to convince myself it was a dream, but the bruises on my arms say otherwise. I don't take the subway anymore. Sometimes, though, when I walk past a station late at night, I hear it, the faint sound of a train approaching. Its brakes screeching in the distance, and if I look down, I see it, the old train, waiting. Story 4. The room at the end of the hall. When I was a kid, my family moved into a large old house on the edge of town. It was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but my parents assured me it was because it needed some renovations. I didn't question it at the time. I was 10 years old, and the house felt like an adventure. There was one part of the house, though, that I never liked. The room at the end of the hall on the second floor. The door was always locked, and my parents told me it was just a storage room, full of old junk from the previous owners. They never seemed interested in opening it, and I tried not to think about it too much. But every now and then, I would hear something from the other side of that door. Soft noises, a faint shuffling like footsteps, or the sound of something dragging across the floor. I told my parents, but they always dismissed it as old house noises and told me to stop scaring myself. One night, I woke up to the sound of a soft knock. It was coming from the locked room. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, and listened. Knock, knock, knock. It was slow, deliberate, and it sent chills down my spine. I pulled the covers up to my chin and squeezed my eyes shut. Eventually, the knocking stopped, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I asked my dad if he'd been in the locked room. He frowned and shook his head. The door's still locked, kiddo. Must have been a dream. That night, the knocking came again, but this time, there was a sound that made my blood run cold. A voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, coming from behind the door. It said, "Let me out." I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, the noises got worse. The footsteps were louder now, and I swore I heard scratching against the door. My parents still wouldn't believe me. My dad even showed me the door was still locked, saying, "See, there's no way anyone's in there." But I knew something was. A week later, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. I always closed it before bed. From my bed, I could see down the hall to the locked door. But this time, the door at the end of the hall wasn't locked anymore. It was open. A sliver of darkness stretched into the hallway, and I felt like something was watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, slowly, the door creaked open wider. I saw it. Something stepped out of the room. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its limbs were too long, bending at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its face. It didn't have a face, just smooth, featureless skin where its eyes and mouth should have been. It moved toward me, its long, bony fingers dragging against the walls as it walked. I slammed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face, and started whispering, "Go away, go away, go away." When I finally opened my eyes, the thing was gone. The door to the room was shut again. The next morning, I told my parents everything. My dad finally decided to check the room to prove to me that nothing was there. He grabbed his tools and forced the door open. Inside, the room was empty mostly. The walls were covered in deep scratches, like something had been clawing at them for years. In the center of the floor was a small, old wooden chair, and sitting on it was a box. My dad opened the box and found an old, cracked porcelain doll inside. Its eyes were missing, and its mouth had been carved into a wide, unnatural grin. My parents threw the doll away and nailed the door shut, refusing to talk about it again. We moved out of the house 6 months later. To this day, I don't know what was in that room or why the door opened for me, but sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I can still hear it. Knock, 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 and a faint voice whispering, "Let me out." Story 5. The Eternal Murmur, Part 1. The Arrival at Arkwell Estate. In the remote, wind-swept moors of Yorkshire lay a desolate manor, known locally as Arkwell Estate. The house, a sprawling, Gothic structure of crumbling stone and ivy-choked walls, had stood for centuries, its history steeped in whispered rumors and grim tales. Few dared to approach it, for the locals swore that malevolent forces lingered within its shadowy halls. Dr. Eliza Harrow, a historian of repute and unyielding curiosity, found herself drawn to this forbidding place. Her recent research had unearthed vague but tantalizing references to an ancient text said to be hidden within the Manara, tome whispered to hold the secrets of immortality and forbidden knowledge. Though warned repeatedly by townsfolk to abandon her quest, Eliza could not resist the lure of discovery. The day she arrived, a thick fog had rolled in, draping the moors in an oppressive gray shroud. The estate loomed ahead like a monolithic sentinel, its spires clawing at the heavens. As she approached, the air grew unnaturally still, the only sounds the crunch of her boots on the gravel path and the rhythmic creak of the rusted iron gate swinging open. The interior of the house was no less unsettling. Dust hung in the air like a spectral haze, and the scent of mildew permeated every corner. The walls were adorned with portraits of the long-dead Arkwell family, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every move. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of whispering voices drifted through the corridors, though she was certain she was alone. Part 2. The Unveiling of the Tome. After hours of searching through the labyrinthine halls, Eliza stumbled upon a hidden library concealed behind a false panel in the study. The room was unlike anything she had ever seen. Towering shelves, lined with tomes bound in cracked leather, their spines inscribed with arcane symbols. At the center of the room was a pedestal, and upon it rested the object of her obsession, an ancient, oversized book bound in blackened, withered skin. Eliza's hands trembled as she opened the tome, its pages filled with cryptic text and intricate illustrations of ghastly rituals. One particular passage caught her Aja spell, said to grant eternal life, but at a terrible cost. The instructions were detailed, and though she could not decipher the language, she felt an inexplicable compulsion to read the words aloud. The moment she uttered the incantation, the air grew heavy and cold, and the room plunged into darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, a cacophony of overlapping voices speaking in a language not meant for human ears. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, coalescing into writhing forms that danced along the walls. A sudden, bone-rattling scream echoed through the house, and the sound of shattering glass filled the air. Eliza stumbled backward, clutching the tome to her chest, her heart hammering in terror. Yet, even as fear gripped her, a strange exhilaration coursed through her veins. She felt as though she had touched something profound, something beyond human comprehension. Part 3. The Haunting of the Mind. In the days that followed, Eliza found herself unable to leave the estate. Whenever she attempted to step outside, the fog thickened, obscuring the path and disorienting her until she was forced to return. At night, her dreams were plagued by vivid and horrifying visions, shadowy figures standing over her bed, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, the sensation of cold hands gripping her wrists and ankles, holding her down as an unseen force whispered in her ear. Worse still, the whispers began to follow her, even in waking hours. They grew louder and more distinct, echoing through the halls and seeping into her thoughts. At first, she tried to block them out, but the voices carried an insidious allure, promising knowledge and power if she would only listen. Driven to the brink of madness, Eliza returned to the library, desperate for answers. She pored over the tome, her mind unraveling as she delved deeper into its forbidden knowledge. The book seemed to respond to her growing desperation, revealing new passages that had previously been blank. One such passage spoke of a watcher who guarded the threshold between the mortal realm and the Abyssa, being that demanded fealty from those who sought its gifts. Part 4. The Final Revelation. On the seventh night, the whispers reached a fever pitch, and Eliza was compelled to perform the ritual described in the tome. She gathered the required items: candles, a ceremonial dagger, and an offering of blood, and descended into the estate's basement, where a stone altar stood at the center of a circular chamber. As she began the ritual, the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting as though in anticipation. The whispers grew louder, forming a single, commanding voice that urged her to continue. With trembling hands, Eliza completed the final incantation, and the room was consumed by blinding darkness. When the light returned, she was no longer alone. Standing before her was the Watcher, a towering figure cloaked in shifting shadows, its face a void of endless blackness. Its presence was overwhelming, a crushing weight that drove her to her knees. The Watcher spoke, its voice a deep, resonant echo that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "You have called, and I have answered. What will you offer in exchange for eternity?" Eliza realized too late the true cost of her ambition. The voices that had haunted her, the shadows that had stalked her, they were the Watcher's previous supplicants, bound to it for eternity. As the creature extended its hand, she felt her soul being pulled from her body, her essence consumed and added to the chorus of whispers. Epilogue. Years later, a group of paranormal investigators ventured into Arkwell Estate, drawn by tales of its haunted past. Among the many ghostly phenomena they documented, one stood out: a disembodied voice, faint but unmistakable, whispering over and over again, "Beware the Watcher, beware the Watcher." Part 5. The Watcher's Domain. For what felt like an eternity, Eliza floated in a void of utter darkness, her mind fragmented and her sense of self slipping away. The whispers, now deafening, surrounded her, a symphony of despair and anguish. Each voice was distinct, yet they blended into a singular, overwhelming force, a collective of souls bound to the Watcher. In this timeless abyss, she became aware of others, faint, flickering remnants of those who had come before her. She could see them only as formless shadows, their once human features eroded by years, perhaps, centuries spent, trapped in this purgatory. They reached out to her, their movements slow and languid, as though swimming through a viscous sea. One shadow drew near, and Eliza felt a jolt of recognition. It was a man, his hollow eyes burning with a faint, otherworldly light. She realized, with a pang of horror, that she had seen his portrait in the Manor's gallery. It was one of the original Arkwell family members. His mouth moved soundlessly, but through the cacophony of whispers, she discerned his words. The Watcher takes, but it also bargains. You are not yet lost. Before she could question him, the void shifted, and she was pulled away, her consciousness flung into a maelstrom of torment and visions. She saw glimpses of the Watcher's world, vast, otherworldly expanse of towering black, spires and churning, skies of blood-red clouds. The ground writhed as if alive, and rivers of molten shadow snaked through the landscape. At the center of this realm stood the Watcher, its form now more defined. It was a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and faces, each feature shifting and writhing as though trying to escape its own body. Its hollow eyes burned with an ancient, malevolent intelligence, and its voice resonated in her mind. You are mine, but your story is not yet written. Serve me, and you may walk the mortal plane once more. Defy me, and you will remain here, a whisper among whispers. Part 5, The Bargain. Torn between fear and desperation, Eliza found herself agreeing to the Watcher's terms. The exact nature of the agreement was unclear, the words slipping from her lips as though not her own. She felt a searing pain as the Watcher's essence branded itself onto her soul, a mark invisible to the eye, but impossible to ignore. In the blink of an eye, she was back in the estate's basement, gasping for air. The room was as she had left it, but now it felt alive with an unnatural energy. Her body was unchanged, but she could feel the Watcher's presence within her, an oppressive weight that whispered constantly at the edge of her thoughts. The whispers no longer came from the house, but from her own mind. They guided her, urging her to leave the estate and spread the Watcher's influence. She resisted at first, but the compulsion grew stronger with each passing day. The Watcher demanded offerings new, souls to replace those it had lost over the centuries. Part 7. The Keeper of the Estate. Eliza's return to the world outside the estate was fraught with terror. Her once sharp mind was now clouded by the Watcher's will, and her every action seemed dictated by forces beyond her control. She found herself drawn back to the Manor time and again, unable to stay away for long. Over time, she became the estate's unwilling caretaker, ensuring that its ominous reputation persisted. She would send cryptic messages to those curious enough to investigate, luring them into the Manor's grasp. Each time a new soul entered, the whispers grew louder and the Watcher's power swelled. But with each offering, Eliza felt a piece of her own humanity slipping away. Her reflection in the cracked mirrors of the estate began to change. Her eyes darkened. Her skin grew pallid, and her shadow moved independently of her body. She realized, with growing dread, that she was becoming a part of the estate itself. Her physical form tied irrevocably to its walls and corridors. Part 8. The cycle continues. Decades passed, though time seemed meaningless within the confines of Arkwell Estate. Eliza's name faded from memory, and new legends arose about the manor and its strange inhabitant. Some spoke of a pale woman who wandered the halls, her eyes hollow and her voice a mere whisper. Others claimed to hear her weeping late at night, her cries blending with the ever-present murmurs. The estate became a magnet for thrill-seeking paranormal investigators and the occasional unfortunate traveler. Each new visitor was drawn into the Watcher's web, their souls feeding the ancient being's insatiable hunger. And through it all, Eliza remained, caught between life and death, a vessel for the Watcher's will. Epilogue: a new whisper. One stormy night, a young man named Simon arrived at the estate, armed with modern recording equipment and a skeptical mind. He was determined to debunk the legends surrounding the manor and expose the truth on his popular podcast. As he explored the house, he felt an inexplicable pull toward the basement. There, he found the ancient tome, its pages blank except for one passage written in blood-red ink. To those who seek immortality, beware, the Watcher sees all. Before Simon could leave, the whispers began, soft and insistent, calling his name. And in the shadows, a pale figure watched, her hollow eyes glinting with a flicker of recognition. Part 9. Simon's Descent. Simon shivered in the damp air of the basement, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The whispers seemed to crawl into his ears, wrapping around his thoughts. Though fear clawed at him, his curiosity burned brighter. He had spent years debunking haunted locations, exposing frauds and fabrications. Arkwell Estate was supposed to be another myth to unravel, but something about this place felt different. He took a cautious step closer to the pedestal where the ancient tome rested. The air grew heavier with each step, as though the house itself were watching him. The blood-red passage on the open page seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Simon leaned in to read it again, but as he did, the ink began to shift, forming new words before his eyes. Call its name, and you shall see. The air seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Against his better judgment, Simon whispered, "The Watcher." Instantly, the candles around the room flared to life, their flames an unnatural black. The shadows deepened, twisting and writhing like living things. Simon stumbled backward, his breath coming in gasps, but his feet refused to move beyond the boundaries of the room. From the darkness, a shape began to emerge, a towering figure, cloaked in undulating shadows. Its form both solid and insubstantial. Its face was a void, featureless, save for two hollow, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce Simon's very soul. The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of voices that seemed to spill from the creature itself. "You have called me?" the Watcher intoned, its voice a resonant echo that seemed to reverberate through Simon's bones. "What will you offer in exchange for what you seek?" Simon's mouth went dry. "I don't seek anything," he stammered. "I just wanted to know the truth." The Watcher tilted its head, a grotesque mockery of curiosity. "The truth is never free." Part 10. The Bargain of Curiosity. The room began to spin, and Simon felt as though he were being pulled into the void of the Watcher's gaze. Images flashed before him: Eliza performing the ritual, the Arkwell family summoning the creature centuries ago, and countless others who had fallen victim to their curiosity or greed. He saw their souls trapped in the Watcher's realm, their faces twisted in eternal torment. But he also saw something else. Among the chaos, he glimpsed a possibility, an escape, buried deep within the Watcher's domain. The visions faded, and Simon found himself back in the basement, the Watcher towering over him. "You may leave," the Watcher said, its voice cold and final, "but the price will be your silence. Speak of this place, and I will take what is mine." Simon hesitated, his mind racing. He knew he should leave, but the lure of the truth was too strong. "What are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The Watcher's form shifted, its shadows twisting into a shape resembling a human. "I am what you mortals have made me. I am hunger. I am knowledge. I am the price you are always willing to pay. You call me the Watcher, but I am older than your words, older than your gods." It reached out a shadowy hand, and Simon felt an unbearable pressure in his chest. "Now choose, leave and forget, or stay and know. The choice is yours." Part she, into the void. Simon's instincts screamed at him to run, but his curiosity won. "I want to know," he said, his voice trembling. The Watcher's hollow eyes flared, and Simon was consumed by darkness. He found himself in the same abyss where Eliza had been trapped, the void filled with writhing shadows and the anguished murmurs of countless souls. Unlike Eliza, Simon retained a faint sense of control. He focused on the visions he had seen earlier, the flicker of escape. One shadow approached him, its movements slow and deliberate. It was Eliza. Her hollow eyes glinted faintly in the darkness, and her voice was a faint whisper among the chaos. "You shouldn't have come," she said, "but if you're here, you can help. There's a way to break the cycle." Simon's heart pounded. "How?" "The tome," Eliza replied. "It's the key and the chain. Destroy it, and the Watcher's grip will weaken. But you must resist its whispers. It will try to stop you." Before he could ask more, the void shifted, and he was pulled back into his body. He awoke in the basement, the tome still on the pedestal. The Watcher loomed over him, its presence more oppressive than ever. "You cannot defy me," it said, its voice a guttural growl. "You are mine." Part 12, the final act. With every ounce of willpower, Simon lunged for the tome. The whispers surged, filling his mind with promises and threats. He saw visions of power, immortality, and unimaginable knowledge, but he also saw the faces of the trapped souls, their silent pleas cutting through the noise. Ignoring the Watcher's looming form, he grabbed the tome and hurled it into the nearest candle. The flames erupted, consuming the book in an unnatural blaze. The room shook violently, and the Watcher let out a deafening roar, its form flickering and breaking apart. As the tome burned, the whispers faded, replaced by a profound silence. The shadows that had dominated the room dissolved, and the oppressive weight lifted. Simon collapsed to the floor, his body trembling. When he regained consciousness, the estate was empty. The air was lighter, the oppressive aura gone. But Simon could feel something inside him, a faint trace of the Watcher's presence, a reminder that the battle was not entirely over. Epilogue: The Whisperer's Burden. Simon left Arkwell Estate and returned to his life, but he was not the same. The Watcher's mark remained, a shadow in his thoughts, that he could never fully shake. He vowed to keep the truth hidden, knowing the danger that knowledge posed. Years later, Simon received an email with no sender address. It contained only one line: "The Watcher sees all." Part 13. The Mark's Influence. In the months following Simon's escape from Arkwell Estate, he struggled to return to normal life. Though the whispers were gone, he often felt the presence of something watching him. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long in his apartment, and he woke most nights drenched in sweat, haunted by dreams of the Watcher's void and its hollow, glowing eyes. At first, he dismissed these feelings as paranoia remnant of the trauma he had endured, but soon, strange occurrences began to plague his daily life. Objects would move on their own, faint murmurs would echo in empty rooms, and his reflection in mirrors sometimes lingered a fraction of a second too long. The mark the Watcher had left was not just a metaphorical reminder, was a tether. Though Simon had destroyed the tome and weakened the entity's grip on the mortal plane, a fragment of its essence remained bound to him, a crack through which the Watcher could still reach. One night, Simon awoke to find his walls covered in cryptic symbols scrawled in ash. The symbols were the same ones he had seen in the tome, and they pulsed faintly with an unnatural light. When he tried to erase them, his fingertips burned as though touching molten metal. A voice whispered softly in his ear, a chilling reminder: "You cannot escape me. The tether holds, and I will return." Desperate, Simon sought the help of occultists and experts in the paranormal. Most dismissed his claims as delusions, but one reclusive scholar named Dr. Marina Greaves took his story seriously. She had spent her life studying entities like the Watcher, which she referred to as threshold beings, ancient forces that existed between worlds, feeding on the ambitions and fears of mortals. Part 14. The Origin of the Watcher. According to Dr. Greaves, the Watcher was one of the oldest of its kind, a being born from the void that existed before time itself. In the earliest days of humanity, shamans and mystics had reached out to these entities, seeking forbidden knowledge. The Watcher had been summoned countless times across centuries, each summoning binding it closer to the mortal realm. The Arkwell family, she explained, had been among the most infamous to bargain with the Watcher. In the 16th century, the patriarch of the family, Lord Geoffrey Arkwell, had summoned the entity in a desperate bid to save his dying wife. The ritual succeeded, but the cost was steep. While his wife was restored to life, she became a vessel for the Watcher's influence. Her body twisted and her mind shattered. Over generations, the family continued to serve the entity, using the tome to lure others into its web. "What you did," Dr. Greaves told Simon, "was extraordinary. Destroying the tome severed the Watcher's primary anchor to our world, but it cannot be destroyed so easily. As long as you bear its mark, it will find a way back." Simon's heart sank. Then what can I do? How do I stop it for good? Dr. Greaves hesitated before replying. There is only one way to truly banish a threshold being. You must enter its domain and sever its essence from the source. But no one who has ever tried has returned. Part 15. The Journey to the Abyss. Determined to end the Watcher's threat once and for all, Simon agreed to undertake the ritual Dr. Greaves described, using fragments of the destroyed tome and symbols from the estate. They prepared a summoning ritual knot to call the Watcher, but to open a gateway to its realm. The ritual required an offering, a piece of Simon's own soul, to pierce the veil between worlds. As the symbols etched into the floor began to glow, Simon felt a sharp tearing sensation in his chest. A swirling vortex of shadows opened before him, and before he could hesitate, he stepped into the void. The Watcher's realm was as horrifying as he remembered, a sprawling, ever-shifting expanse of black spires and crimson skies, and the air was thick with the screams of trapped souls. As Simon ventured deeper, he heard the whispers again, louder and more menacing than ever. "You dare return." The Watcher's voice boomed, resonating through the realm. "You are mine, Simon. You cannot defeat me." But Simon pressed on, guided by the faint memory of Eliza's words. He knew there had to be a core, a central point where the Watcher's essence was strongest. That was where he could sever the tether and destroy the entity for good. Part 16. The Final Confrontation. At the heart of the realm, Simon found a massive, pulsating monolith of shadow and light, its surface etched with the same symbols that had haunted him. Surrounding it were the souls of the Watcher's victims, their forms flickering and distorted. Among them was Eliza, her hollow eyes now filled with a faint spark of determination. "You found it," she said, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. "Destroy the monolith, and the Watcher will fall, but it will not let you succeed." As if on cue, the Watcher emerged from the shadows, its form more monstrous than ever. Tendrils of darkness lashed out at Simon, and the ground beneath him split open, threatening to swallow him whole. Summoning every ounce of courage, Simon charged toward the monolith. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a shard of glass he had brought from the estate, a fragment of the mirror where he had first seen the Watcher's reflection. The shard glowed brightly, a weapon forged from the Watcher's own essence. With a scream of defiance, Simon plunged the shard into the monolith. The realm erupted in chaos, the shadows writhing and collapsing as the monolith fractured. The Watcher let out a final, ear-piercing roar before its form disintegrated, its essence scattered into the void. Epilogue: Freedom and Legacy. Epilogue: Freedom and Legacy. Simon awoke in Dr. Greaves's study, his body weak but intact. The mark on his chest had faded, and the oppressive presence was gone. For the first time in months, his mind was quiet. Though the Watcher was defeated, Simon knew the battle was not entirely over. Other threshold beings lingered in the void, waiting for their chance to breach the mortal world, determined to prevent others from making the same mistakes. Simon dedicated his life to studying these entities and sharing his knowledge with those who would listen. But late at night, when the world was still, Simon sometimes thought he could hear a faint whisper in the darkness, a reminder that the void was always watching. Part 17. The Void Beckons. Simon's life after the Watcher's defeat was far from peaceful. Though the oppressive weight of the entity was gone, his encounter had left a scar, not just physical, but spiritual. He was haunted by the knowledge that the Watcher was just one of many threshold beings lurking in the spaces between worlds. Dr. Marina Greaves had explained that the void was an ancient, liminal realm where these beings thrived, feeding on humanity's desires, fears, and ambitions. Each threshold being had its own domain and method of influence, but all shared the same goal: to breach the mortal plane and expand their dominion. After months of studying with Dr. Greaves, Simon learned of other incidents linked to threshold beings' disappearances, cursed artifacts, and places where reality itself seemed to warp. Together, they began investigating these occurrences, hoping to prevent more souls from being inspired. But Simon started to suspect that Dr. Greaves knew more than she let on. Her knowledge of the void was unnervingly detailed, and her methods were often cryptic. One night, he confronted her. "Why do you know so much about the void?" he demanded. "You said you've studied it, but it feels like you've been there." Dr. Greaves hesitated, her usually stern demeanor faltering. Finally, she spoke. "I have," she admitted. "Years ago, I faced a threshold being of my own. Its name was Erythrellis, the weaver of truths. It promised me knowledge, answers to questions I'd spent my life seeking. I thought I could outsmart it." Simon leaned forward, sensing the weight of her confession. "And what happened?" "I bargained. I escaped, but not unscathed," she said, pulling back her sleeve to reveal a series of intricate, glowing symbols etched into her skin. "I'm marked, just as you were, but my mark ties me to the void in ways I barely understand. That's why I help you, Simon, because I know the cost of failure." Part 18. The Call of the Weaver. Their next case brought Simon and Dr. Greaves to an isolated village nestled deep in the mountains. The locals had reported strange phenomena, people disappearing, time seeming to slow or speed up, and a massive, spider-like figure glimpsed in the woods during storms. Dr. Greaves grew pale when she heard the descriptions. "It's Erythrellis," she said grimly. "It's found a way to influence the physical world again." Simon felt a chill. "If it's your threshold being, does that mean it's after you?" Dr. Greaves shook her head. "It's after anyone who seeks truth. Erythrellis lures victims with promises of revealing their innermost desires, but its truths are always traps, threads that bind its victims to its web. If it's here, then someone must have summoned it or worse, bargained with it." When they arrived in the village, the signs of Erythrellis's influence were unmistakable. Web-like patterns marred the walls of homes, and strange, golden strands hung from the trees, shimmering in the moonlight. The villagers spoke of hearing whispers in the night, voices that offered answers to their deepest fears and questions. Simon and Dr. Greaves traced the source of the disturbance to an abandoned church on the village's outskirts. Inside, they found a circle of golden runes etched into the stone floor, pulsating with a sickly light. At the center of the circle was a young woman, her body suspended in mid-air, wrapped in threads of glowing silk. "It's already feeding," Dr. Greaves whispered. "We're running out of time." Part 19. The Weaver's Web. As they approached the young woman, the room began to shift. The walls stretched impossibly high, and the ceiling dissolved into a starless void. From the shadows emerged Erythrellis, a massive, spider-like figure with a humanoid torso and countless eyes that glimmered like fractured glass. Its voice was a soft, melodic whisper that echoed in their minds. "You return to me, Marina," it said, its tone dripping with mockery. "And you bring another seeker. How delightful." Dr. Greaves stepped forward, her voice steady. "Erythrellis, you won't take this village. Release the girl, and I'll face you myself." Simon's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "It's the only way," she replied. "It wants me. I'm the one who escaped its web." But Erythrellis only laughed. "You misunderstand, my dear. I have no need for you anymore. You are already mine. But your companion, he carries the scent of another." The Watcher touched him, and he carries its echoes. I want to see how he unravels. Before Simon could react, threads of golden silk shot out, ensnaring him. His vision blurred as he was dragged into the void, the world around him dissolving into a labyrinth of shimmering webs. Part XX, the labyrinth of lies. Simon found himself trapped in Erythrasis Domena, vast, endless web, suspended in a void of swirling light. Each strand of the web pulsed faintly, and as he touched one, he was flooded with memories not his own, but those of countless souls who had fallen victim to the weaver. The whispers returned, but this time they were different. They spoke not of fear or compulsion, but of doubt. What truth do you seek, Simon? Erythralis's voice echoed from every direction. What lies have you told yourself? Let me show you. Images began to form in the strands around him, visions of his past, his failures, his regrets. He saw himself standing in the basement of Arquel estate, hesitating before destroying the tome. He saw the Watcher's mark burning on his chest. He saw Dr. Greaves, her face twisted in pain, her body consumed by golden threads. The weaver's laughter filled the air. You cannot escape your truths. You are bound to the void, just as I am. Accept it, and I will release the girl. Deny it, and you will remain here forever. Simon clenched his fists, fighting the rising tide of despair. You're wrong, he said. My choices brought me here, but I'm not bound to the void. Drawing on the lessons he had learned from his battle with the Watcher, Simon focused his mind. He remembered the shard of glass he had used to destroy the monolith. Though he had no physical weapon now, he realized he didn't need one. The void was shaped by thought and will, and he could fight back. Summoning his courage, Simon imagined a blade of light forming in his hand. The threads around him recoiled as the blade took shape, its brilliance cutting through the darkness. Erythras screamed as Simon slashed through the web, severing the strands that bound the girl. The domain began to collapse, the shimmering threads unraveling into nothingness. Part 21. A fragile peace. Simon awoke in the church, the young woman cradled in his arms. Dr. Greaves knelt beside him, her face etched with relief and exhaustion. The golden runes on the floor had faded, leaving only scorched stone behind. You did it, she said softly. Simon nodded, his body trembling. But it's not over. Erythralis is still out there, just like the Watcher. They're waiting, watching. Dr. Greaves placed a hand on his shoulder. Then we'll keep fighting, together. As they left the village, Simon couldn't shake the feeling that their victories were only temporary. The void was vast, and its inhabitants were patient. But for now, they had one, and that was enough. Part 22. The Void's Whisper. Months passed after their confrontation with Eryth, and while the village had returned to normal, Simon and Dr. Greaves knew it was only a matter of time before another threshold being emerged. The void was restless, its influence seeping into the mortal realm more frequently. Simon began to notice something strange. The tether that had once bound him to the Watcher hadn't completely vanished, it had transformed. He could sense disturbances in the veil between worlds, faint ripples in reality that hinted at the presence of threshold beings. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the sensations grew stronger with each passing day. Dr. Greaves studied him carefully, her expression a mix of concern and fascination. You're changing, Simon, she said one evening as they pored over ancient texts in her study. The void has left its mark on you in more ways than one. Simon frowned. What do you mean? You're becoming Attuned to it, she explained. You can feel its presence, sense the threshold beings before they manifest. It's a gift, but it's also a curse. If you're not careful, the void might claim you entirely. Despite her warning, Simon couldn't ignore the pull he felt. He began keeping a journal, documenting the ripples he sensed and the strange dreams that plagued him. In these dreams, he wandered an endless labyrinth of shifting corridors, each door leading to a different realm. Sometimes he heard voices calling out to him pleas for help, whispers of warnings, and, occasionally, chilling laughter. One night, Simon woke with a start, his heart pounding. He had dreamed of a new threshold being one unlike the Watcher or Erythralis. This one called itself Kathia, the Collector of Names. Part 23. The Collector's Game. Kethir's influence began to manifest in a small coastal town called Greyhaven. The townsfolk reported hearing their names whispered in the wind, accompanied by a strange compulsion to write their names repeatedly. Soon, people began disappearing. Their names scrawled across walls, mirrors, and even the sand of the beach. When Simon and Dr. Greaves arrived, the town was eerily silent. The air was thick with tension, and a sense of dread hung over the deserted streets. They discovered a pattern. Every missing person had written their name in a frenzy before vanishing. It's a form of binding, Dr. Greaves explained. Names hold power in the void. By taking their names, Kethir is claiming their identities and their souls. Simon clenched his fists. Then we need to stop it before it takes anyone else. How do we find it? Dr. Greaves hesitated. Kethira's domain is tied to Greyhaven now. The more names it collects, the stronger its tether becomes. If we can find its anchor, whatever object or ritual is allowing it to manifest, we can sever its hold. The search led them to an abandoned lighthouse on the edge of town. Inside, they found the walls covered in names, written in a dark, viscous substance that smelled faintly of the sea. At the center of the room was a large, obsidian mirror that pulsed with an unnatural light. As Simon approached the mirror, his reflection twisted and distorted, transforming into a shadowy version of himself. The reflection grinned, its voice a low, mocking whisper. "Simon, you've come so far. Shall I add your name to my collection?" Part 24. The Mirror of Names. The room darkened as Kethir's presence filled the space. The mirror began to ripple like water, and from its surface emerged a figure cloaked in tattered robes, its face obscured by a swirling void. In one hand, it held a quill made of bone, dripping with ink that shimmered like starlight. "You mortals are so eager to be remembered," Kethia said, its voice a chorus of overlapping tones. "You carve your names into stone, paper, and flesh, hoping to escape oblivion. But names are fleeting, and I am their final resting place." Simon stepped forward, his fear replaced by defiance. "You won't take anyone else. Release the names you've stolen." Kethir tilted its head, as if amused. "You think you can command me? Your name is already written in the void, Simon. Shall I show you where it leads?" The mirror's surface shifted, revealing a vision of Simon trapped in the void, his name etched into every surface around him. Dr. Greaves grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Don't look at it," she warned. "It's trying to ensnare you." Realizing the mirror was the anchor, Simon focused his energy. The void's mark within him began to pulse, resonating with the mirror's power. He reached for the shard of glass he had kept from the Watcher's realm, remnant of his first battle with the void. With a yell, Simon drove the shard into the mirror. The glass shattered, releasing a surge of energy that knocked them both to the ground. Kethier let out a deafening shriek as its form dissolved, its tether severed. Part 25. The Price of Resistance. As the energy faded, the names scrawled on the walls disappeared, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The missing townsfolk began to reappear, dazed but unharmed. Simon and Dr. Greaves left Greyhaven, knowing their victory was only temporary. Dr. Greaves studied Simon as they drove away. "You're becoming more connected to the void with every battle," she said. "It's like it's feeding on you." Simon nodded, his jaw tight. "I feel it. Every time I fight one of them, it gets harder to come back. But if I don't do this, who will?" Dr. Greaves didn't reply, but her silence spoke volumes. Epilogue. The whisper of many voices. Back at Dr. Greaves's study, Simon reviewed his journal. The dreams had returned, stronger than ever. This time, the labyrinth was filled with doors, bearing familiar symbols, the Watcher's hollow eyes, Erythrolus's threads, and Kethris' quill. But there were more doors now, each marked with symbols he didn't recognize. One door stood out. It bore a sigil unlike any he had seen before, twisting, serpentine shape, surrounded by flames. When he touched the journal's page, the symbol seemed to burn into the paper, accompanied by a single word. Simon's heart sank. The void wasn't finished with him yet. If you liked this video, subscribe me and press the bell icon button for more scary stories.